Every story shapes the way we see the world. Stories of resilience, creativity, and discovery. I'm Christine Musser, the host of this podcast, The Wandering Pen, a space for conversations with writers, historians, and storytellers who inspire. Together, we'll explore the past, embrace the present, and uncover new perspectives. Welcome to episode 10. Today's episode took place on Friday, March 7th, 2025. My guest is Dieterich-Ward, author of Cradle of Conservation, an environmental history of Pennsylvania, which is today's discussion topic. Dr. Dieterich-Ward is a professor of history and director of the graduate school at Shippensburg University. He is the author of Beyond Rust, Metropolitan Pittsburgh, and the Fate of Industrial America, which won the Arline Custer Memorial Award for Best Book in Mid-Atlantic History. On the back cover of Cradle of Conservation, David Stradling, professor of history at the University of Cincinnati, shares the following about the book, and I quote, "Despite the brevity, Cradle of Conservation contains great breadth. From the spiritually rich and actively managed working landscape of the Haudenosaunee Iroquois Nation and Lenape to the post-industrial heritage preservation movement, Dieterich-Ward has enriched the narrative with details from the lives of many Pennsylvanians, some as well known as Rachel Carson, and some who will be new to most readers, including Ralph Brock, the nation's first Black forester. This is a concise and powerful history of one of the nation's great energy states," end quote. Thank you, Alan, for being here today. I really appreciate you agreeing to do this. So thank you. And
my pleasure, Christine. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Okay. First, I want to say that I love reading this book, not only because of the history of conservation in Pennsylvania, but also because of how smooth the reading is and the descriptive detail. Within 131 pages of your book, you cover so much information on Pennsylvania's history, from pre-European contact to post-industrialization. A lot of changes took place during that time period. I wish we had more time to cover all the topics. So, to start off, I have so many questions, but I know I can't ask them all. But let's start off with the title of the book. Why the Cradle of Conservation?
Well, I think there are a number of different places that have laid claim to the term Cradle of Conservation. It just rolls off the lips, doesn't it? You could look to the Vanderbilt plantation, where Gifford Pinchot took up sort of large-scale landscape work in the latter part of the 1900s. You could look to New York State, where you have the Adirondacks and the Catskills really set aside for conservation and preservation a few years before Pennsylvania. But I think Pennsylvania is actually the best place to really think about conservation work, because the conservation movement as a social and political movement, beyond the protection of a single site and beyond sort of the single use of protecting water supply for New York City and the Erie Canal, which is what the Adirondacks and the Catskills really were set aside for. Pennsylvania really is the cradle of what we think of as the conservation movement as a popular movement, and that really came about because of sort of the statewide issues with deforestation and other problems that prompted a popular social and political movement in a way that that didn't exist elsewhere. I think, as I say in the book, many of the themes that we see associated with conservationism down the road, clean, and urban conservation with the City Beautiful movement, really start here in a real and meaningful way in Pennsylvania. And then over time, similarly, many of the innovations that we think of with the subsequent environmental movement and the social justice movement have their key starting points here in Pennsylvania. And so if we kind of think about the ways in which environmental protection has evolved over the course of the 20th century, I don't think you can find a better place than Pennsylvania to explore the different, different ways that has manifested.
Yeah, definitely. Because there's a lot happened in through here. So the next thing this is a place that just intrigues me, which is the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. You started out with in the beginning of your book talking about that. So would you
Sure.
share a little bit about that? Yeah.
Sure. When I set out to write this book, I had a number of different motivations. And one of those motivations, though, was to think about the ways in which people can get out in today and see places in the state of Pennsylvania that are reflective of this kind of long history of the interaction between people and landscape in Pennsylvania. And really the oldest one of all of those, and the reason I start chapter 1 with this is Meadowcroft Rock Shelter southwest of Pittsburgh. And Meadowcroft Rock Shelter really upended the dominant narrative of the timing of when Homo sapiens populated the Americas, right? Primarily, of course, as we know, through this, through the last ice age, through the Bering Land Bridge from Asia. But because during that ice age, many miles of coastline, which were above water and would have been the places where those peoples initially sort of settled and spread out, are now under the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. Some of the earliest days of that, that migration are still a mystery. And the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter really upends sort of the dominant narrative of the time period in which the earliest culture, identified culture, the Clovis people, named after a site in New Mexico, really began to establish human society. And Meadowcroft radiocarbon dating, which proved to be controversial, but has really stood the test of, over the last few decades, stood the test of time in being accurate, really pushes back the date by several centuries of earliest human habitation. And you can really see that, 10, 15, more than 15,000 years worth of human habitation of Pennsylvania. You can see that at this rock shelter that was initially kind of unearthed in the 50s and then became a real important part of the archaeological record in the 1970s.
It is a popular place, it gets a lot of visitors, I know. The other thing was that I thought was really interesting, and I've done some Native American study into the stories of their culture. And I found it really interesting too that you included the Native American creation stories. You shared about turtle and muskrat, sky woman, otter and beaver, good twin, and sky grasper. If you want to share some as to why you included that as part of this.
Sure. As a historian, I wanted to make sure that we really grounded the story of Pennsylvania in the stories of the first Pennsylvanians. right? And being able to align the sort of archaeological record and the the geologic record, the meteorological record, these sort of data-driven science records, with the stories that people told to explain how their peoples and how their cultures came to being. That's really important as a historian, of any time period. But I thought it was particularly important to do that for these peoples who we don't have written records from, and to really give support and acknowledgement that the way they understood the evolution and development of their people is every bit as important as the frankly, mythologized, understanding of the peaceful kingdom of William Penn, right? Which in and of itself is a creation story that doesn't always align with the actual, of what actually happened.
Right.
So I wanted to be able to blend, as I do in that first chapter, sort of one way of understanding the evolution of human society in early Pennsylvania, and that is sort of the archaeological record, but to also do it in terms of the cultural record through oral traditions of the Haudenosaunee and the Lenape people, and sort of looking for the way in which we can blend those two ways of looking at the past.
It's really interesting, and I really liked that part. But I mean, there was a lot of pieces I liked about it. But the other thing too is I'm going to ask you about the working landscape, and then I would like you to share some of highlight the most influential people, during in your book.
Okay. Well, you hit on this when in your introduction to the podcast today, Christine, and that is, this is a whole lot to do in 125 pages. And it was really, really important to me. I think there is this sort of misconception about environmental history that it's just about trees. And it is about trees, don't get me wrong. But just because you pave over a forest, right, or you build a canal, or you build a town in what used to be a meadow, that doesn't mean that the environment just goes away at all, right? And as an environmental historian, and as someone who particularly focuses on urban environments, I not only wanted to tell the environmental story of Pennsylvania, of its rural areas, but also to really underscore the fact that our urban and suburban areas have just as much environmental history as these other places. And so that made it even more difficult to try to do it all in 125 pages. And so, I settled on, thinking about, what are the stories of people, of places, and of policies that I want to tell. And the organizing principle that I used, in addition to trying to get a geographic range and to trying to really underscore some lesser known stories along with the big name stories, was the notion of a working landscape, right? And I think getting back to the idea of why Pennsylvania's Cradle of Conservation, if you're doing the environmental history of say the Great American West, right, where these huge national parks were created, right, and when we think of the American environment, we sometimes think of those. Well, leaving aside the fact that those places, of course, always had people there too, right? It took the U.S. cavalry to remove the folks from Yellowstone and Yosemite, for example. Here in Pennsylvania, you can't get away from the fact that that humans have always been shaping and reshaping the natural world, right? And so, from the native peoples all the way through up the present, and so in many ways, thinking about conservation as as underscoring the fact that humans are a part of the natural world and have responsibility for it, the notion of a working landscape really is part and parcel of that. That is to say that these are not places that are separate from human beings. They are places in which people live and work and play on, on a very deep basis. And so thinking about Pennsylvania as a working landscape, as places where work is done, but also as places, I oftentimes my public lectures that I do, I start out with having people kind of close their eyes and think about a Pennsylvania landscape. Well, in doing that, those landscapes also do work in terms of cultural work. They help create identity. They help to spur political movements and social, social movements in a way that then, create new ways in which those landscapes are used. And so, kind of holding all of this together through that concept of working landscapes as I'm exploring the places, the people, and the policies that have come to define Pennsylvania. That's how I was able to to get it all done in 125 pages or so.
Well, it's done well. It was like that didn't surprise me. So the people. Let's highlight some of the people and then go into the movement, the changes. As far as transportation, what did transportation, all of that do to the landscape and affect, and of course Drake's finding of oil before Texas. So there's a lot there.
Already, Christine, you're even having trouble asking a question without getting into 4 or 5 different questions. It's hard to do, isn't it? Well, let me do this then. Let me frame things out in the way that I do in the book, and we'll think about let's think about three different working landscapes that involve 3 different groups of people and 3 different policies. Okay. And I'll actually give you an example of the way I do things without going too far. Benjamin Franklin's kind of a good example to get started with. When we look at the first settlement of Philadelphia, in kind of this mythologized meeting between Franklin and between William Penn and the Lenape people, happens at Dock Creek, which is right in the middle of Philadelphia right now. It is under the streets. But in Franklin's time, it was it was a free flowing stream. And if you ever go to Philadelphia, Franklin's print shop and home are right along where Dock Creek is. Although again, Dock Creek is in a culvert underneath, in a sewer pipe underneath of the street now. But even by the time Franklin was living in Philadelphia in the 1750s and 60s, Dock Creek had become absolutely filthy. All the tanneries and the reduction shops, or reduction factories, et cetera, were right along Dock Creek, and were kind of putting all of their effluent right into the creek. And Franklin and his neighbors, they started a petition to the city fathers to move these noxious industries away from the creek. And that didn't work. Then as now, industry often triumphs public health. But it made such an impression on Franklin that in his, right shortly before he died, in the last codicil to his will, Franklin set aside a portion of his estate for improving public works, especially public drinking water in Philadelphia. And about a decade or so after Franklin's death, sure enough, Benjamin Henry Latrobe was commissioned to create the first major public works for drinking water in the Americas, and that later became the Fairmount Waterworks. Right. So by kind of taking this site, Dock Creek, and examining the people that lived along Dock Creek and sort of made their lives around Dock Creek, you can get an understanding of why particular public policy interventions, in this case public drinking water, evolved. To jump forward, and again, I don't want to take everything up for this, and so you stop me anytime you want. But if we want to think about sort of the next, major significant intervention based on working landscapes, it's the working landscapes of industrialized timber harvesting, right? In the late 19th century. And sort of out of that working landscape of unsustainable forestry practices, comes the conservation movement. Mm-hmm. And there are a whole bunch of people, some really well known, like Joseph Rothrock, some lesser known folks like Myra Lloyd Dock and Ralph Brock, who is the first professionally trained African American forester in the world. And then there are some even lesser known people who are extremely important, like Maria Cox and Mary Lundy, who are these basically kind of socialites in Philadelphia, who one of them is Mary Lundy, is the wife of a prominent Episcopal minister who vacationed in the Adirondacks and were really moved by kind of the spiritual nature of the woods. Mary Cox, who was married into one of the most really wealthy and important families in Pennsylvania. If you ever had Eckley Miners Village, the PHMC property focusing on coal mining, that was named after her brother-in-law. Eckley Cox and her husband Brinton was one of the founders and at the time the president of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And really, Mary Lundy and Maria Cox really created the Pennsylvania Forestry Association because they were so moved by by Joseph Rothrock's lectures on the subject, that they pulled all of their, well-connected friends together, including Gifford Pinchot and Joseph Rothrock, and launched the Pennsylvania Forestry Association, which within a few years of its founding had way more people than the American Forestry Association, and really these women became the foot soldiers that created the conservation movement and the City Beautiful movement in Pennsylvania. So, go ahead, Christine?
Yeah, well, what is interesting, you said about the forestry, and I know about Pinchot just from whenever I was at SHIP during grad school with Dr. Bloom, and he said about, we talked Pennsylvania history, and talking about Pinchot and how Pinchot's father was a great cutter of trees. He really destroyed the forest.
His grandfather, yes. Mm-hmm.
What did I say? Did I say Gifford Pinchot?
His father. His
father. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, his father. So which then turned Gifford into who he became. So that is just one of those amazing. It's just that too. But so when we're talking about that, let's talk about. So the forest was the start with the trees, but then also whenever we're talking about transportation, the railroad, the whole industrial period, and what that did to Pennsylvania's living landscape, or working landscape.
Sure. Well, Pennsylvania, water is the main transportation system, through most of human history, and up through the middle part of the 19th century. Even in the 1830s and 1840s, it was cheaper to haul a ton of coal from the colliery in Wales, in Britain, all the way across the Atlantic to Philadelphia, than it was to transport a ton of coal overland from the anthracite coal regions, of the Wyoming Valley, of Reading and of northeastern Pennsylvania, right? And so there was this real push to develop canals, these kind of artificial rivers, throughout the East Coast, of course. But Pennsylvania has this interesting political dynamic. It still does, right? As you can, just by looking at the difference between Steelers fans and Ravens fans and Eagles fans. But because of Pennsylvania's geography, the main river system, the biggest river system in Pennsylvania, the biggest watershed, taking up a third or so of the state, is the Susquehanna River watershed, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the Susquehanna River doesn't flow to Philadelphia, right? It flows to Baltimore.
Right.
And so, unlike in New York State, where you have kind of the main river system, the Hudson and Mohawk River systems flowing down to New York City, there was this unified push to connect that river system and thus out to Lake Erie. And so the environmental shape of New York really fosters this integrated politics that the development of the Erie Canal really helps and supports, right? Because then basically all of the cities in New York are along this Erie Canal to Mohawk River to Hudson River.
Mm-hmm.
Pennsylvania doesn't really get moving in that direction because it's divided, right? And you can't really, like, the economics, Pittsburgh is looking down to the south and west, right? And Philadelphia is looking to the north and east. Right. And the Susquehanna River doesn't flow, it flows to Baltimore.
Yeah.
But the opening of the Erie Canal really pushed the wise fathers of Philadelphia into action, and so they finally sort of pushed through legislation in Harrisburg to get this canal system done, the Pennsylvania mainline system. But the environmental problems with that mainline system don't just go away, and so anyone who kind of has been to Allegheny Portage Railroad knows that even the best case scenario of a canal, you really still have to take everything out of the canal and put it on these railroad cars and move it up over the Allegheny Mountains.
Right.
So this is kind of one of those cases of, well, necessity breeds invention, because Pennsylvania isn't able to develop an effective canal system and is sort of losing out day by day to New York City. The railroad innovations in steam power technology really take off in Pennsylvania, right? It's not an accident that the biggest railroad corporation of the 19th century, that is second only to the national government in terms of budget, is the Pennsylvania Railroad, kind of originating out of Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And so the canal era doesn't last all that long in Pennsylvania, because it's kind of immediately subsumed by railroads. Mm-hmm. in a way that New York, the Erie Canal is much more successful in New York State. Mm-hmm. But the trick with railroads is that they require an enormous amount of material to be able to run, right? And mm-hmm. so, unlike the horsepower and the efficiency of a canal, you have to have a lot of either wood or coal just to run the trains. You have to have a lot of steel and iron to manufacture and maintain the rails and the cars, and you have to have an enormous amount of wood for railroad ties. And so what happens is that even as the railroads sort of connect the state together and sort of link supply and demand throughout Pennsylvania, they also really drive demand on their own. And so this requires enormous amounts of wood that is coming from increasingly distant places, in northern Pennsylvania. And of course, harvesting that wood as quickly as possible for the railroads. And then by the 1880s and 1890s for homes out, for wood homes out on the Great Plains where there aren't very many trees, you see this factor where the ability to harvest very quickly and the demand for that harvest really manifests themselves in this very rapid denuding of hillsides, and that's really where the motivation for forest conservation comes from.
Yeah, and I remember there was something, the Allegheny National Forest, right? That, which was hit pretty hard with that, with it. So do you want to share some with that? Of course, it's about trees again, but
it's just, I mean, it's
more than trees. It's the whole nature that is affected there, not just the trees, but it's the others, Yeah.
Sure. I mean, so I think that this gets to the Allegheny National Forest is sort of it reflects a broader trend within Pennsylvania. So if you look at, and this is why, again, another reason why I think calling Pennsylvania Cradle of Conservation makes a lot of sense. If you look in New York State, the two enormous areas that are set aside, in the Catskills and particularly on the Adirondacks, these are these really just huge areas that are set aside kind of for the particular needs of kind of one group of people, right? In Pennsylvania, both the landscape and the need is different. And so as you see the development of state forests in Pennsylvania, they're much more widespread. They're not just focused on one big place, but they're kind of throughout the whole state, right? I mean, like they are dispersed in the headwaters of lots of different, rivers and streams, and so it's kind of a much more geographically dispersed area that the state forests touch. The Allegheny National Forest is, it is created after the Weeks Act that allows for the federal government to start creating forest reserves in the East. I mean, all of the original U.S. forest reserves were in the West. It is, kind of just another example of these kind of really kind of formally inaccessible places with land that is denuded. And also, another aspect of this is that with the consolidation of agriculture and the opening of the Great Plains, this kind of great breadbasket for agriculture, many of the small farms that were perched in these isolated areas, they're no longer self-sufficient. They can't, there's no market for them to sell into. And so you have kind of vast swaths of the state that are essentially depopulated, and that then allows for the state to step in at basically at tax sales and to purchase this ground. None of the ground is taken through eminent domain. It's all kind of purchased, or nearly all of it's purchased. And the Allegheny. I mean, if you look at the map of Pennsylvania State Forest today, the Allegheny National Forest is essentially just the equivalent of of one of the state forests where. It would have been a state forest if the federal government hadn't bought it. Yeah,
I mean, I've been through there, and it's wonderful. It's a beautiful place, but yeah.
Right.
So let's start talking about the movements and how these things started getting cleaned up. And who put them forth.
Sure. Well, I've given you an example already of the early movement for conservation, which is really, I think, an easy way of delineating it is that conservation, the forest conservation movement is really about the production side. I mean, it's justified in a number of different ways. But it's really about sustainability in terms of production. Making sure that natural resources that have fueled Pennsylvania's economic development are going to continue to be able to fuel Pennsylvania's economic development for the future. And that's the way that you can get these kind of relatively conservative sort of progressive Republicans on board and sort of create a social movement out of this, right? Because it's not about setting these places aside to never be touched like a national park is.
Right.
It's about conserving these resources so that it can be harvested, in the future. The next movement that really emerges, the environmental movement, has a bit of a different focus. And I'm going to simplify this just, in order to be able to explain it. But if the production, if production was the driving factor for the conservation movement, then consumption was the driving movement of the environmental movement. And if the landscape that really created the conservation movement were these denuded forests, hillsides, then I think Levittown or the suburban landscape is really the landscape that drives environmentalism. Mm-hmm. And you can think of it this way. I mean, the environmental movement, in the post-World War II period, you see this period of great economic prosperity and development. And many people move out of the cities into, formerly rural areas with the promise that they are going to be able to have the opportunities and the economic prosperity of urban life, while also having the access to the pastoral landscape, to public health, to recreation, mm-hmm. To beauty, to quiet in the rural areas. Mm-hmm. But pretty soon, of course, industry follows them, and thousands and thousands of other people do too. And so within a few years, when your backyard septic system fails, and your backyard is a poopy swamp, and the neighboring woods that your kids were playing in now becomes the neighboring subdivision, mm-hmm. and the factory that is belching out smoke is now new ones are being built near you. That notion that you can both have economic development and a clean natural environment. When that is questioned, you mm-hmm. see this whole group of folks who demand new kinds of public policies, environmental policies that aren't just about individual resources, but are about the environment as a whole. Taking from Rachel Carson's popularizing of ecology, of this notion that everything is connected. You see this development of public policies around environmental protection emerging out of this working landscape of consumerism. And if Joseph Rothrock was the father of Pennsylvania's state forests, then kind of the leading and most important figure during this period is Maurice Goddard, who was the longtime secretary of the Department of Forests and Waters. When the Department of Environmental Resources was created in 1970, he becomes the Secretary of Environmental Resources. Mm-hmm. Of Pennsylvania state parks, because under his time period, Pennsylvania state parks just absolutely exploded in their number and their popularity. And mm-hmm. if you think about, kind of the difference or the motivation behind a state forest versus behind a state park, you can get that sense of the ways in which the conservation movement and the environmental movement are similar in some ways, but also different in their motivations.
Yeah. And when you're talking about that, of course, I'm seeing, I guess I'm old enough to remember Pittsburgh and the whole habitation or of what happened with Pittsburgh. But I remember reading about Denora. Denora was one of them that really has stuck in my mind, whenever that happened. I think it was the 1940s or early 50s. There was I think it was a zinc factory or something, and it ended up putting out all of this like black smoke. I think the book was When Water.
You're talking about the Denora smog, I think you're talking about, yes, Christine?
Yes. Yeah. That, that was just one of those things in the Pittsburgh mm-hmm. area. So moving on with that, and getting into Harrisburg, the City Beautiful movement, I had studied Vance McCormick, who was the mayor at the time, whenever that went through. And so that was the start of the early 20th, or the early 20th century. It was around the early 1900s with Meadowcroft, and so they cleaned that up, and what, a sewer was put in, and all the water and
and that was really part of that progressive movement, part of the conservation movement. The City Beautiful movement was kind of the urban side of the forestry movement that happened at that time.
Yeah. So, is there anything else that you would want to touch on before that we haven't? I know, is
where to begin, right?
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about, but just trying to.
Well, if we've talked about the progressive movement a bit, the conservation movement, and we talked about the environmental movement, then I think the kind of the third big phase of places, people, and policies is really the environmental justice movement, and that really, while that thread of civil rights and environmental justice carries through kind of the whole period, the whole history of Pennsylvania. It's really deindustrialization and this question of how to go about ensuring, thinking about what does a post-industrial Pennsylvania look like, that we see this kind of third period of public policy making, farmland preservation, rails to trails development, and really thinking carefully about who is left out of environmental policies, and how do you go about balancing environmental and public environment and public health with the need for economic development. And those, of course, are the issues that we're really struggling with today.
Right. That is one of the things. It's the in planning. There's the sustainability. That there's that balance. And it's supposed to be that balance between development and preservation or conservation. And we see it right here in Cumberland County a lot. In this area where we have the interstate.
That's right.
Yep. So let's talk about a couple of the rails to trails, some of the things that have come out. Let's just, and I'm going to have Katie Hess and Julia Chain on Tuesday. I'm doing with them, and they're going to talk about the state of the South Mountain region. So, so just, you have the rails to trails that you've been working at. Yeah. So the rails to trails that you have, that's up in Shippensburg area. So, you have that. And I think the ultimate goal is to actually get that down towards the Susquehanna, down that, to try and stretch it down, or, as we go to try and find more places to enjoy the outdoors, while you enjoy the history.
That's right.
Yeah. So, so there was that, and then there's trying to think, of course, the Appalachian Trail that goes through here. And so, is there anything else that the post-industrial? I did want to talk more about that. Is there? Okay. So, if there's something that that you want to highlight, what was the outcome post-industrial, which is kind of like what we're living in now?
Yeah, I think we're still struggling to figure out what an appropriate balance is today. Yep, that's really, and I think if we kind of wrap things back together, because of Pennsylvania's the fossil fuel resources that we have in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania really is an important stand-in for the nation as a whole in terms of figuring out how we go about using resources. While also conserving and maintaining those resources within a context of where we are politically today.
Right, right. And I know, throughout Pennsylvania, we've had our scars of strip mining, and then, of course, the fracking, that once the fracking is done, they pick up and they move somewhere else, is my understanding. So the damage that is done, the environmental damage that is done, it's left there.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I thought was so interesting here was, the book, Pennsylvania and its resources. Goes back to, if you look at the coal mines, is there anything else you'd like to touch base on? If anybody wants to purchase your book, which is published by Temple University, how can they get your book?
Sure. You can get it at all the places that you normally get books. I will actually be in Williamsport next week, giving a talk at the Auto Book store, and then at New Trail Brewing. And then at the end of the month, I'll be at Midtown Scholar in Harrisburg. So if folks want to come and pick up a copy of the book and meet me and get it signed, then I'm happy to do that. You can find any information about the book and then the broader Pennsylvania Conservation Heritage Project that the book is a part of at paconservationheritage.org.
That is paconservationheritage.org, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Alan, thank you for joining me today, and really appreciate you taking the time. So, that's it for this week's podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week for my conversation with Katie Hess and Julia Chain from South Mountain Partnership, where they will share the State of the Region report that assessed the environmental, recreational, and cultural factors that impact the Appalachian Trail within the South Mountain region. And if you haven't subscribed to the Wandering Pen podcast, please do so you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more about the Wandering Pen, check out www.thewanderingpen.net. Until next time, keep exploring and writing your own story. I'm Christine Musser.